pipes go out into the front yard through that wall. And we had a horizontal drilling rig which will drill pipes into the ground horizontally. And we have 2 loops that go out into the yard that are about 250 feet long. And they're filled with glycol, so they won't freeze. They're about 25 feet deep, so there's not much chance of them freezing anyway. It stops in here at this contraption, which is an air separator. So occasionally you'll get bubbles that are in the line when they install it. And this allows those bubbles to be separated out. And from there it goes into the geothermal heat pump.
I'd just like to mention too, speaking of the pipes outside, they're made out of a high density polyethylene material that gives pretty good heat transfer through the walls of the pipe. So it's kind of a black plastic pipe that's buried out under the yard. So it either picks up heat from the ground or delivers heat to the ground, depending on what mode you're in, whether you're in a cooling or a heating mode. Once that water comes into the heat pump, there's a heat exchanger there that has, the water goes through the heat exchanger, and either the water in the house, which is a separate system, they're separated by that heat exchanger that passes through each other and gives up or picks up heat depending again on which mode you're in. So if you're in the heating mode, it's going to extract the heat out of the water that's been picked up from the earth and transfer that heat into the water that goes into this buffer tank. This buffer tank really is a thermostat that controls the whole system. So there's a thermostat mounted on the buffer tank, and it's going to maintain a preset temperature about 110 degrees in that tank. So regardless whether the house is calling for heating or not, this buffer tank is always going to have about 40 gallons of water in it that's at that temperature, so that when you make that demand for heating, you already have 40 gallons of water there to circulate through the floor and heat the house. So there's no forced air in this house. It's all done by pipes, and you can see some of the tubing that's going up into the concrete floor upstairs and delivering the heat to the floor. And this concrete floor is a large thermal mass, so once you put heat into that floor, it tends to stay there for quite a long period of time, so it doesn't dissipate quickly. You're really not only warming up the floor, but warming up the whole structure as well, because once that heat radiates through the floor, it starts radiating through the walls, and the whole house becomes warm. The geothermal itself uses a compressor to do the work. It's a refrigerant compressor. It uses a refrigerant called R410A, which is an environmentally friendly refrigerant, which means that if it's actually released in the atmosphere, it's not going to deplete our ozone layer or cause any issues there. Maintenance on it is, it comes factory pre-charged and shipped pre-charged, so there's really nothing as installers or service technicians that we need to do with the compressor unless there's a failure. So we don't even like to hook our gauges to it when we first install them, because they've done that at the factory and made sure everything was good there. There's some pumps in there. There's sealed bearing pumps that circulate the water through the system. There's one here that circulates water outside into the earth to pick up or deliver heat to the earth outside, and then there's pumps here that pump that water into whichever zone is calling for heating at the time. And this system is somewhat unique. There aren't a lot of them installed, but it does cooling as well. Again, as I mentioned, this is not a forced air system, so there's no air movement. It's just circulating water through that big thermal concrete mass, which is the house. In the cooling season, what we do is, this has a reversing valve on it, and it reverses the direction or the path of refrigerant flow. So we can actually take the water that's coming in from outside, which again is separated by a heat exchanger, and circulate water in the floors and remove the heat that's built up in the floors into the water. It comes back to this unit, and that heat is removed or transferred into the water and piped outside and dumped into the earth. In the summertime, there's a lot of moisture in the air. And if there's a lot of moisture in the air and we're cooling off a floor, getting a concrete slab cold, we could end up with condensation on the floor. Water in houses is not a good thing. It causes mold, and the unit just satisfies its demand. But water in a house is not a good thing, so we have a control system that you can see that actually monitors the dew point upstairs in the space to make sure that we don't get near that dew point and start to condense water in the house. The system will actually run cooling and try to satisfy the thermostat unless that dew point goes above a certain level, a predetermined or set level, and then it will shut off the unit. There may still be enough cold water in the buffer tank, it will continue to circulate, but at least it won't be getting it any colder. So you won't stop cooling the house or stop removing heat from the floor, but you'll shut the system down or the compressor so you don't get the water any colder, again, to avoid water development on the surfaces of the concrete slab. There's also what's called a desupergator. So when we're cooling, we have extra heat because we're taking heat out of the floor and dumping it outside. So as opposed to transferring that heat into the earth, we can actually transfer some of that heat into making domestic hot water. Desuperheater does that automatically. It has a separate pump inside the unit, a circulator pump, that circulates through these two small copper lines that then go into the domestic system. So the additional heat that we're removing from the space, instead of just bringing it outside, we're going to capture some of that heat and make hot water with it, which is pretty efficient. This geothermal system can make water as cold, or fairly as cold as I want it to, but the problem with water and it getting cold is there's a certain point that it changes state from a liquid to a solid. And we can't pump solids around in pipes very well. So there's another thermostat that is functioning only during the cooling mode when it's trying to cool the house, that will limit this water to a temperature of about 55 degrees. Can't get any colder than that. So when it's monitoring the temperature on this pipe, when the water is circulating through this pipe, it's sensing the temperature here, and if the temperature gets to 55 degrees, then it will shut off the compressor in the geothermal unit, which is fine. Again, the house is still cooling, the water is still cold enough to remove heat from the house. And then as the load increases, the water temperature will increase, and this thermostat then will allow the geothermal to come back on. So kind of two different concepts. We have this thermostat cooling mode is like a low limit. This thermostat in heating mode is actually the thermostat that controls the temperature of the tank. So summertime, we're running about 55 degree water through the system. Wintertime, we're running 110, it's 115, 120 degree water. And that tank's going to maintain that at all times so that we have buffer, we have enough capacity when we ask for it. The thermostat is actually a Wi-Fi enabled thermostat, so you can access that thermostat through a web browser or an app on a smartphone and change the temperature from wherever you are in the world and check on the system. It also does data logging, so it logs the temperature of the house throughout the day, all day, every day, so you can see what the trends are and what the temperatures in the house are, when the unit's on or off, when it's calling for heat or calling for cooling, and monitor that as well. So this is just the interface for that thermostat, and then this interface module is wired into the control module, which, depending on the demand from the thermostat or what the thermostat's asking for, will command the heat pump to do what it needs to do. As far as the system goes, it's a sealed system, so once we fill it up with water and purge all the air out of it, out of the house side of the system, we should never have to add water back into it unless there's a problem. So the problem would be a leak. There are manifolds throughout the house upstairs, just like this one here. One of them is a supply manifold and one's a return manifold. So it's just a loop of pipe buried in the concrete, and we're circulating water through that and returning it back to the buffer tank. If one of these springs a leak, then you're obviously going to have water. There's an automatic system here that refills the system. So if water leaks out, this is called a pressure reducing valve. We don't put city water pressure into those pipes. It's actually only at 12 psi, and your city water pressure or well system operates somewhere around 50 or 55 psi. So this reduces that pressure down to 12, cold fill pressure. Again, if there's a leak, this will turn on and fill the system back up with water, which can be an issue if you're not around and there's a leak somewhere. It's just going to continually start pumping water into that. Again, the pumps are sealed bearing pumps. The motors are cooled by the water going through it. So as far as maintenance goes on there, there's really nothing that needs to be done. on a regular maintenance basis. Since it's a sealed system, the tank should never have any sediment in it or any problems with that. There's one other system here that's the hot water heater, and the geothermal system has a zone that will heat your hot water. There's a thermostat here that controls that temperature. So this system actually has a coil going around the outside of the tank that will deliver hot water from the geothermal system at about 110, 120 degrees, and that transfers into the hot water so you can make hot water for your domestic use. This tank though does need some maintenance on it because it is not a closed system, it's a potable or domestic water system. That tank will develop sediment, and normally what I recommend is to drain the tank and stir the tank to relieve the sediment, especially on a well system where you can have some iron and buildup of things like that. To drain this on a yearly basis to make sure you get that out of the bottom of the tank to avoid it filling up with sediment. There's also an expansion tank on this system with an air separator. As water heats up, it expands and takes up more volume, and the pipes aren't going to expand, so there's a bladder tank here that allows for that expansion. And again, when the water warms up, it expands, and there's a bladder in there, kind of like a balloon, that allows the extra water from the expansion to go into this tank. It doesn't actually hold water, a very little bit of water, but it's just a bladder that depresses. This is under pressure. Really doesn't need to be checked unless, again, there's a problem.